We'll be taking a little bit of a break this weekend from our educational series of homilies, because this weekend we celebrate Mother's Day, we celebrate graduation, and this year we have a lot. We have 7 graduates from St. John's and 1 graduate from St. Germanus, and so you're going to get the graduates' graduation homily today, even though they're not here now. They'll be here tomorrow morning, but I just remember the summer after I graduated was a very busy time for me, and so it'll be a busy time for our graduates. It'll be a time full of changes, and I've gone entire summers of my life without really remembering any details of them, anything remarkable from them. But I think the summer after I graduated from high school, and when I think about it, it's amazing to think that so many important things happened during that summer. So many events that actually had an effect on my life that are still relevant today. Changes that have led me to where I am speaking to you right now. Things happened that summer that, had they not happened, I would not be here, and I probably wouldn't be a priest. Normally, for my graduation homily, I sort of lightheartedly tell one of the stories of how I almost died. There's actually 5 of them, and I have 2 on rotation. But I'm not going to do that this year. I've been here long enough where you probably have those stories memorized. But I'm not even going to tell stories about the summer after I graduated. Instead, I want us to think very deliberately, and you don't have to be graduating high school to think this way, but think very deliberately on the meaning of certain events in our lives. To take some time out of what could be a busy summer and ask yourselves, how did I get here? Who are the people that have led me here? What events, good and bad, had to happen in order for me to be where I am now? And when you do this, you will notice a couple of things. First, you'll notice that we live in a very small world. And second, you'll notice that we live in a great big world. But it's when those 2 worlds, the small world and the big world, come together, that's when we have to be paying attention to those moments. I was taught from a very young age that there are no such thing as coincidences, that even the smallest details of life have the greatest of meanings. And they can be, there's a great sacredness to that. That when I look back on certain events in my life, it's remarkable that I'm here in this church in particular now. And it's as if every step of the way, God has been preparing me my whole life to be the pastor of this church in particular, which is kind of a weird thing to think about. And that it's kind of strange how this place has entangled itself in my life in a very personal way long before I ever moved here, long before the bishop called me on that random March afternoon in 2016 to tell me that I would be the pastor here. And looking from the outside, it's just a long string of coincidences. But from my perspective, it's full of meaning. Of course, it's my life, and so reflecting upon it reveals a lot to me. And perhaps that's the thing that I want you to take away from this talk, that every aspect and every moment of your life has meaning if only you look for it. A lot of the story that I'm going to tell and all the connections that I have, a lot of it has to do with the church and the shrine in Arapahoe, actually. But whether you like it or not, I'm totally aware of the sometimes hard feelings between the 2 towns. But these 2 churches are tied together for the foreseeable future, and they're tied together in my life. If I weren't the pastor here, I wouldn't be the pastor there, and the connections wouldn't exist. You can't tell the story of my life without both of these parishes. So I told this story to the LDCCW meeting last month, but the story of my connection with this place on earth actually starts 70 years before I was born. It sort of requires a lot of explaining, but I promise there's a point here. So there was a priest named Father Joseph Kentenich who taught at a seminary in a town called Schoenstatt in Germany before, during, and after World War I. So we're talking, the mid to late 19 teens. And one of the projects that he had his seminarians take on was transforming a garden shed that was on the grounds of the seminary into what he called a shrine to Our Lady, to the Blessed Mother. Eventually, this group expanded beyond the seminarians and included the education and spiritual nourishment of young peoples and families in particular. And this all became part of what Father Kentenich called the Schoenstatt movement, named after the town where it started. And it was a way for young people and families to consecrate themselves and their families to Jesus through Mary. And members of the Schoenstatt movement, they're asked to make what's called a covenant with a covenant of love with the Blessed Mother to place their complete trust in Jesus. And this was all a result of Father Kentenich living through 2 world wars in his home country, and he taught others to live only according to God's will rather than to their own will, because it's only in God's will that we are assured of really anything. The Schoenstatt movement spread across the world, and part of the Schoenstatt movement is that replicas of the original shrine that was a garden shed originally on the grounds of the seminary were built all over the world. There's hundreds of them around the world. And the North American headquarters for the Schoenstatt movement is located in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And when Bishop Bruskowitz, who is a priest originally of the Milwaukee Archdiocese, when he was named bishop of our diocese in 1992, he brought the Schoenstatt movement with him. And so my parents were in the first group of Nebraskans to be involved in the Schoenstatt movement. And along with a few other couples, they made their covenant to Jesus through Mary, the Mother, thrice admirable, Queen and Victress of Schoenstatt. That's her official title. Years later, I was the first seminarian in the history of the Diocese of Lincoln to make that same covenant, the Schoenstatt covenant, later on in life. And then as a seminarian, my final year in the seminary, I wrote my master's thesis, which ended up being about 75 pages long, on the life of Father Joseph Kentenich. So very involved, very much part of my life growing up. And I promise this is all relevant, and here's why. In 1941, Father Kentenich was arrested by the Nazi Gestapo. For months they had been closing in on him. And when the Nazi regime shut the seminary down in 1933, Father Kentenich continued teaching. He continued his work of educating young Catholics, especially families, and he was unafraid when it came to preaching and protesting the actions of the Nazi government. And that's what drew their attention to him. So eventually he would be imprisoned in the Dachau concentration camp. Dachau was where most Catholic priests that were arrested by the Nazis, they were sent to Dachau. They were considered to be political prisoners. And so that's where they were kept during the duration of the war. And so it was there that Father Kentenich met a lot of other priests that had been arrested by the Gestapo. He was assigned to prison block 28, which is where most of the Polish priests were being held. And that's where Father Kentenich would meet a young Polish army chaplain named Father Henry Dennis. And Father Dennis had been held at Dachau since the very first days of the war. He was captured almost immediately in the conquering of Poland in 1939. And so he'd been there for years at this point. And during those years, Father Dennis had been tortured. He had been exposed to alternating temperatures of extreme cold and extreme heat. He had been the subject of medical experimentation, including being injected with various viruses and diseases, including malaria. Father Dennis he was at the end of his hope. He had nearly lost all hope, and that was when he met Father Kentenich. So Father Kentenich, he sort of passed on his devotion to Mary to Father Dennis, who he taught to never lose hope, and he taught him to trust in Jesus, especially to devote himself to the Blessed Mother. And so it happened on October 7th, 1944, the Feast of the Holy Rosary. There was a miracle that occurred on that day. 2 prisoners had attempted to escape the concentration camp, and as a punishment, the prisoners were all called out to the front of their barracks, and they read out random prisoner numbers, and they were called out for immediate execution as a form of punishment, a random draw. And this is what Father Dennis wrote about that day. It was a cold and windy, rainy morning. There was a long roll call and prolonged counting. There were many corpses on that day, and all the dead had to be brought and placed in line with those who were alive. There was a lot of shouting, cursing, kicking, and clubbing. One prisoner was missing. Finally, they found him. He was dead. To forget that hell on earth, deep in my mind and in my heart, I prayed the rosary. The rosary took me up there into a different world. There were moments that I did not hear anything. Around 7:30 a.m., we left the camp to our working places. One German priest, a good friend of mine, asked me, "Henry, why did they call your name and your number?" Then 2 Polish priests asked me, "Henry, what did they want from you?" And my blood stopped to circulate. To be called and not to report at once, that is immediate death. And death flashed before my mind as never before. What excruciating hours those hours were. But when we returned to the camp, nobody called me anymore. Evidently, they got their number of victims. They always called more than they needed. A dear friend of mine, Father Francis Doctora, was also called in that day. He reported, and he never came back. And it was on that day, October 7th, 1944, that I made a promise, a vow, that if I ever leave the camp alive, I would give the Blessed Mother some kind of visible gratitude, maybe a little shrine. So it's because of his being totally engaged in prayer that he didn't hear his number called out, and his life was spared. Father Dennis immediately immigrated to America after the liberation of the death camps and concentration camps of Nazi Germany. And at the invite of Bishop Kuchera, he was assigned to St. Germanus Parish in Arapahoe in 1949. Now, to add to some layers here, it'll all come together in the end, I promise, but it's worth talking about St. Germanus himself, like the guy that the church is named after. So there's a lot of weird connections with him. So St. Germanus was the bishop of Constantinople, one of the most important cities in the ancient world. And it was during his time as bishop that a movement called iconoclasm broke out. So iconoclasm was this idea that was really spearheaded by the newly founded Muslim religion at the time, that all images like statues and paintings must be destroyed because they were idols. They were, it was pagan practice to have images of people, and they mistakenly thought that they were being worshipped. And so St. Germanus fought against that. Now keep in mind that the parish of St. Germanus was named 70 years before the shrine was even built. So there wasn't any intentional connection there. But it just so happened that a shrine full of statues in Arapahoe was built next to the church dedicated to the man who defended the use of statues in churches. And not only that, on top of that, the feast day of St. Germanus was this last Friday. It was yesterday. And today is the feast day of Our Lady of Fatima, which is the Fatima shrine in Arapahoe. So it's all connected together. 7 years after arriving in Arapahoe in August of 1956, Father Dennis realized the fulfillment of that promise that he made in the concentration camp. He built a shrine dedicated to Our Lady of Fatima, and it was built with contributions of money and stones from 43 different states, from Canada and Europe. And the following year, they added the altar that is in the shrine now. And since then, there's been other additions and memorials and trees and plants that have been added to the shrine. Father Dennis stayed there in Arapahoe until 1960. So, let me go through the coincidences to show you that these aren't coincidences. I was assigned to St. Germanus and St. John's exactly 60 years after Father Dennis finished building that shrine, in a parish named after St. Germanus, who defended the use of statues, the only church I've ever heard named after St. Germanus. He's a completely obscure saint. St. Germanus, whose feast day is the day before Our Lady of Fatima, which I don't think even Father Dennis knew. A shrine dedicated to Our Lady of Fatima that was likely inspired by Father Kentenich, who helped lift the spirits of Father Dennis. Father Kentenich, who I wrote a 75-page paper about in college before being ordained a priest, the priest who founded the Schoenstatt movement, an organization that my family has been involved in since I was 10 years old. On May 31st, 2010, so this would be the Feast of the Visitation, I was wearing this exact vestment for the first time. I celebrated my second Mass ever as a priest in the tiny little replica shrine, Schoenstatt Shrine, that my parents helped to build near Crete, Nebraska. It's a tiny little church. It holds maybe 20 people, but 2 of those 20 people are in the church right now. Steve and Connie Whitty were there. You see, I don't recall a time in my life where I didn't know Steve and Connie because they were friends of my parents from the time I was quite young. And so they were there at my ordination, my first Mass, and my second Mass, as I wore this vestment in the Schoenstatt Shrine in Crete, Nebraska. Little did I know that my first assignment as a pastor would be as their parish priest. In May of 2017, 11 months after I arrived here, Bishop Conley informed me that we would have an outdoor Mass at the Arapaho Shrine to celebrate and commemorate 100 years since the original miracles in Fatima, Portugal in 1917. And it seems that I was assigned here just in time for that. And from May of 2017 to May of 2018, Pope Francis himself declared that that shrine in Arapaho was an official place of pilgrimage for the entire church around the world. Totally unrelated, but this just goes to show you how strange life can get. On March 31st, 2018, I had the honor of giving the sacrament of confirmation to my next door neighbor, Sarah. And, I only bring this up because I've known Sarah my whole life too. She's my first cousin Casey's best friend growing up. I have memories of playing at Grandma's house with Sarah and Casey, and God crossed our paths together 200 miles away from our hometown, literally across the street. It's just kind of crazy. So things like this might not seem like a big deal, but they oftentimes, the little things pack the most meaning. Things like this will happen in your life and have happened in your life if only you pay attention to them. God is telling you way more in the events and the people around you than you realize. But we won't find these things, we won't have time to contemplate these things if we're constantly distracted by the world around us. We need to make that sort of our homework assignment for the rest of our lives, to simply be aware, to reflect on things big and small, that the life that is not reflected upon loses all of its meaning and all of its depth. And a life that is not reflected upon is a life that is not truly being lived. But if you do take the time to see how God works in little ways to tell you big things, to see that God's hand is guiding you the whole way, you realize that every single moment of your life is meaningful. Every single moment of your life is sacred because you are sacred to Him.